So, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to, have you join us for the edition of our Distinguished Personality Lecture. We're hoping we're going to have some more people join us as we continue the program. So, the guest lecturer is already here, Dr. Jill Kelly from Southern Methodist University. Nice to see you again, Jill. I would just like to start by trying to say that I'll be standing in for the moderator, Dr. Zolisi, who is unavoidably absent. We've actually been preparing, for this lecture together. Even up till this morning, we were, communicating. But he's been deployed to take care of some of the issues on ground in KwaZulu-Natal, and we use this medium to wish him safety, peace, and success in his endeavors as they try to restore peace to the two provinces of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. That being said, I would just like to do a brief introduction of our guest lecturer, who is a friend that also hosted me at some point in 2017. So I would just, like, we already have our profile on the website, but if you oblige me, I'll just quickly do like a very quick rundown of it. So Dr. Jill Kelly is an associate professor of history at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, USA. She is also a honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town, of course, in South Africa. She has a very interesting book that was published in 2018 by the Michigan State University Press in the US, and of course the University of KwaZulu-Natal Press in 2019, which is titled "To Swim with the Crocodiles: Land, Authority, and Belonging in South Africa." She's also written numerous articles. I think she's also working on a manuscript for a second book. We can't wait to, read your book and of course feature it in one of our spotlight events. She's won some research grants, of course, from the American Council of Learned Societies, and also she's a Fulbright scholar. Like we know, she's going to be speaking on the topic "Persons Unknown and the Killing of a Peace Chief, and the Truth and Reconciliation," and the persons unknown and the killing of a peace chief. Then the appendage is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and State and Local Violence in South Africa. This lecture cannot come at a better time where we'll have issues, within the province, and also an adjoining province that we're going to be discussing, and it promises to be like an exciting experience. It touches on, I'm not the one to give the lecture, so let me just quickly hand over the platform to Dr. Kelly to give our lecture. So you're welcome, Dr. Kelly, once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. It is a joy to be with y'all today, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Hopefully, when we get on the other side of this pandemic, we can all be together in person.
I'm not sure we can hear you. I can't hear you though, so
let me see.
Can anyone, is that from me? Can anyone hear? If anyone can hear, can you just signify so that I'll just, but I can't hear you though.
Okay, let me see.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, wait. So, Philip,
okay, Professor Lawani says he can hear, so that's from my end. So please continue.
Okay. Thanks, y'all. I was just telling Philip beforehand, technology is our friend until it's not, right? So thank you for having me today, and hopefully we can be together in person someday on the other side of this pandemic. I'm going to quickly share my screen here to kind of walk us through some of my talk today. I have to admit that I'm been watching what is happening on the ground in South Africa with great concern, particularly because of what I study and this kind of longer history of violence in the regions that are experiencing violence in South Africa this week. So to kind of kick us off, that's how I would like to frame the talk. is that as we gather here this week to consider transitional justice in South Africa, right, I'd be remiss not to connect today's conversation to the current events. As many of you will know, the former president, Jacob Zuma, was sentenced to prison for contempt of court, and he turned himself over to police last week. Many were on tenterhooks whether or not he would actually do so. And since then, sporadic protests in his support have devolved into violence. At least 70 people have died as of the last time I checked the numbers. Current President Cyril Ramaphosa's Sunday speech described some of the violent protests as spurred by ethnic mobilization. Members of the president's own party have decried this depiction, pointing instead to the very real structural inequalities that plague the country, as well as actual support for the incarcerated president. Youth unemployment rates are estimated to be nearly 70%, and the overall unemployment rate during the pandemic is close to 50%. Right, there are very real structural causes for the violence, as well as political support for the president. But also, a number of political commentators have not unreasonably begun to argue that there is likely orchestration behind the scenes, right? That it's not just, violence that allows people to accumulate food and clothing, but there have been actual attacks on infrastructure in a way that is cause for concern. This kind of political violence and its attribution to ethnicity, particularly to a militaristic Zulu identity, is not new to KwaZulu-Natal or the Gauteng provinces where Johannesburg and Pretoria are located. Between 1985 and 1996, the KwaZulu-Natal region alone was racked by a civil war in which at least 13,000 died and another 200,000 were made homeless. Another 7,000 was estimated to die in Gauteng. The violence in Gauteng was described as tribal violence, with isiZulu members of the Zulu Nationalist Party in Kata attacking the isiXhosa speakers of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, or the ANC. In KwaZulu-Natal, though, this was a region in which isiZulu speaker fought isiZulu speaker. Here, the apartheid state blamed it on the Zulu speakers, describing it as black on black violence and as evidence that Africans wouldn't be able to self-govern if apartheid ended. While the war came to an end after the first local government elections in KwaZulu-Natal in 1996, since then, over 500 political assassinations have occurred in the province. This trend is attributed to the scramble for state resources, where political bodyguards often double as hitmen. But scholars are also pointing to or connecting these assassinations to this historical political violence that accompanied the end of apartheid. They argue that that violence inculcated these self-sustaining dynamics of violent conflict that now characterize politics in KwaZulu-Natal. And so it's in this context of this long history of violence that I want to revisit the 1991 assassination of a progressive traditional leader who fought to end apartheid. Doing so allows us to flesh out the complexity of this so-called ethnic violence, as well as how South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission shaped what we know and what we don't know about political assassinations. But perhaps most importantly, I think revisiting Ma Phumola's assassination and the aftermath lets us see how local actors formed an important part of national apartheid strategies to counter revolution. So to get us started, I just wanted to kind of orient everyone. This is a map from 1984 of the kind of apartheid Bantustans in the various colors. And so the areas that experienced violence both during the transition and today in South Africa, are these areas around Pretoria and Johannesburg, and in the former KwaZulu, or the then KwaZulu Bantustan, and today the cities of Pietermaritzburg and Durban. And Nkosi Maphumulo, or Chief Maphumulo, he governed in this area in between the Table Mountain regions. So let's talk about the chief. On February 25th, 1991, Mhlabenzima Joseph Maphumulo, the chief of the Maphumulo people at Table Mountain in KwaZulu-Natal, was shot dead as he pulled into the driveway of his Pietermaritzburg home. Nkosi Mhlabenzima was the fourth chief of the Maphumulo. This was a chiefdom that was established by the British colonial administration in 1905. Only a year before the chief's assassination, South African President F.W. de Klerk had unbanned the liberation movements, including the ANC, paving the way for the transition to democracy. But as Mandela walked proudly out of Victor Verster prison on February 11th, 1990, after 27 years in jail, KwaZulu-Natal was burning. And Chief Maphumulo and his people had deserted their Table Mountain homes for refugee camps or homes with family and friends in the city. Increasingly, ANC activists and the people under siege pointed to Inkatha, to the Zulu nationalist movement Inkatha, as an obstacle to peace and liberation. As the conflict raged on, irrefutable evidence began to emerge that the apartheid government had funded Inkatha and provided them with paramilitary training as part of their counter-revolutionary efforts. Chief Maphumulo's assassination sent shockwaves across the Pietermaritzburg communities that had come to know him as the peace chief. This Table Mountain traditional leader had promoted political tolerance, organized peace efforts, and traveled around the world to call attention to the violence racking KwaZulu-Natal. He became the first president of the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, or CONTRALESA, which was a progressive movement of traditional leaders who were arguing that traditional authority should be part of the new South Africa. In the midst of this tumultuous civil war and the revelations about state support for Inkatha, the ANC embraced the deceased chief as one of their own, and they contended his murder was the work of apartheid death squads. So who killed the peace chief? And what does revisiting his assassination teach us? A 1991 provincial inquest into the leader's death suggested a state cover-up, but the judge found that, quote, persons unknown, end quote, had murdered Maphumulo. What we know about this violence in the last years of apartheid has been shaped by steps taken during the transition from apartheid to democracy. Prolonged debate between the ANC and the Government of National Unity, which included the National Party and Inkatha, resulted in the promotion of the National Unity and Reconciliation Act of 1995 that established a South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the time, the Commission's unprecedented attempt to embrace both amnesty for perpetrators and truth-telling and reparations for victims made it the subject of a great deal of scholarship, as well as inspiration for other commissions globally. And I'm sure with all of your work on the transition period, you'll be familiar with some of those. But the commission has not been without its critics, who contend the TRC excluded the everyday violence of apartheid and promoted a consensual history to build a nation. And so there are two threads from this scholarship that I want to draw on today for thinking about Maphumulo's death. And the first is just how important the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been for historians, my own discipline. Across 8 months in 1993, the National Intelligence Service, with its eye to a future democratic South Africa, destroyed over 44 tons of incriminating state records. For this reason alone, the historian Jacob Blamini has recently cautioned against us seeing the commission as a failure. Digging through the details of the commission's testimonies that are available online and files accessible through the Promotion of Information Act enables scholars to really uncover these details that otherwise we might not have access to. And those details allow us these interpretations that fall outside of the commission's consensual history. So that's the first thread. But the second thread is much more critical. The TRC's focus on the political causes of human rights violations under apartheid did obscure everyday violence of apartheid in the very real ways that colonialism and apartheid impacted lives and worldviews of South Africans. It also obscured other explanations for the violence that did not fit neatly into the ANC narrative about state-sponsored violence. Right? This is not to say that state-sponsored violence is not real, but it is also to say that there were other kind of motivations and causes that were interwoven with the state's counter-revolutionary violence. And that's what we're going to talk about today here. The commission had a mandate to make these clear-cut findings about who was victims and who was perpetrators that complicated efforts to understand the transition era violence. Now, the TRC its restorative justice process offered both a carrot and a stick. Amnesty for perpetrators, but also the promise of prosecution for those who had been denied amnesty or who had failed to come before the TRC. The final TRC report in 2003 recommended over 300 cases to the new South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority. To date, only 2 of those have been investigated. For the families of some of those killed in this civil war, as well as the larger anti-apartheid struggle, the new South African state's failure to pursue justice still stings. MTS Kaji, whose uncle Ahmed Temul was murdered in detention in 1971 by the police, described it this way. He said, "We thought that when apartheid ended, South Africa's democratically elected government would go out of its way to shine a torch of truth on the deaths, the disappearances, and the cover-ups, and that it would bring justice to the perpetrators, not least because they were the people who had laid down their lives for freedom. But this has not been the case. Instead, the administration seems to have gone out of its way to find excuses for not investigating the crimes of the past." Kaji's 20-year-long quest for justice for his uncle has renewed national interest in this state failure, especially after an inquest judge ruled in 2018 that a former security police officer could stand trial for Temul's murder and for obstructing justice. During another inquest into the murder of the trade unionist Neil Agate, the National Prosecuting Authority actually admitted that political interference from the new government had prevented them from following up on investigations and prosecutions. Journalists tracked down one of the security officers involved in Neil Agate's murder, and they found him to be well paid for his intelligence and security-related services to the new South African state. Other apartheid-era spies have been documented on the payroll of the current government. This pressure from families like the Temuls and these revelations about former spies on the payroll of the current government have forced the National Prosecuting Authority to commit full-time resources to those TRC recommended cases. This is a kind of brand new development from the last couple of months. But even as these 300 some cases are set to be investigated, there are others that fell through the cracks, and this includes the late chief's assassination. Testimonies given at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provide evidence for the ANC's claim that an apartheid hit squad assassinated the chief. And these testimonies suggest avenues for investigation that were never pursued by the TRC or anyone afterwards. The TRC's efforts to understand the institutional perspectives that gave rise to apartheid violence involved institutional, sectoral, and special hearings. These hearings evidenced the political violence of apartheid. But as the historians Philip Bonner and Noor Neftagodian have pointed out, the focus on the political at the TRC did obscure these other social explanations for the violence. The very format of TRC statement forms and the final report constrained the ability of the commission to come to conclusions other than the political cause, the Inkatha versus the ANC, and a state-supported Inkatha versus the ANC. We see this very keenly in the TRC's treatment of Mapumulo's death. His assassination was lumped under the finding that a large number of community and political leaders, including non-aligned academics, professionals, and members of the clergy, were targeted for attack in planned hit squad operations in the province between 1990 and 1994. Now, that's not untrue. But despite evidence from the TRC that I'll discuss in a minute, the commission found that his killing has still not been solved. In the summary of individual victim findings, the TRC implied that Mapumulo had been targeted for assassination on several occasions on account of his political views. This focus on the hides the ways in which local actors and local sociocultural and socio-political causes facilitated the violence, as well as Chief Mapumulo's assassination. The work on the TRC and recent literature clearly shows the ways in which the apartheid state's counter-revolutionary strategy relied on regional entities such as Inkatha. The TRC found that Inkatha perpetrators dominated their investigations and were the main human rights violators from the mid-1980s forward. Jabulani Sitoli's research on Inkatha firmly situates the cultural organization turned political party as a fully fledged surrogate force in the repressive component of apartheid state's total strategy in KwaZulu-Natal. But what is less clear, and what I'm trying to do in this work that I'm undertaking now, is to show how this collaboration between the state and between Inkatha played out on the ground, how the state's counter-revolutionary tactics exploited local actors and conflicts to achieve their goals. What the assassination of Mapumulo and conflicts around his chiefly authority show is how these local agents and how local conflicts played key roles in the state's counterinsurgency strategy. And so to get at how and why these local actors shaped the implementation of the state's strategies, I want to lead you through several kind of key pieces of evidence that have not been followed up by the TRC or in investigations since then. These include what is very clearly a state cover-up into his death at the time of the official inquest into his murder, as well as revelations at the TRC, and then two pieces of evidence from Mapumulo's community. So let's turn to this first. Days after the chief's 1991 murder, a man claiming to be a state intelligence agent with information about the chief's death phoned newspaper reporter Lakayla Kaunda, claiming to have knowledge about the chief's death. She then heard nothing from him for 2 months. But in April 1991, Sipo Matlala, pictured in both of these kind of press clippings here, walked into the newspaper's office and confessed to murdering the chief. Matlala claimed that he had operated as part of a 5-man team acting on orders of the security branch and the South African Defense Force military police based in Natal. And so this reporter sat down with Matlala for an interview in which he detailed the events leading up to the assassination. At the time, she believed him. She turned Matlala over to the ANC intelligence services, in which former President Jacob Zuma was a key member. The ANC took responsibility for Matlala, placing him in a Soweto safe house while they investigated his claims. Matlala's claims sparked a high-profile investigation and provincial inquiry into the chief's death. Most deaths were investigated at a magisterial level, but because of the kind of claims about a hit squad around this, it occurred at the provincial level. Now, of course, the inquest records are missing, which is perhaps not surprising. The South African Police Commissioner General Johan van der Merwe announced a special team and sent Major General Ronnie van der Westhuizen to begin investigations into Matlala's claims. Now, already at this time in 1991, this General Ronnie van Westhuizen was known as General Fix-It. He had earned a reputation for cover-ups and less than zealous investigations of police complicity, and his involvement from the start of this investigation should raise a red flag, right? It suggests the police and security forces were intent to cover up their involvement in Mapumula's assassination. Most notoriously, van der Westhuizen had assisted the investigation into another massacre where the South African police had a kind of rare ethical police officer. His name is Captain Frank Dutton, who would later work with the TRC. When van der Westhuizen was sent to work with him on this other massacre, he quickly realized that the general had been sent to obscure the investigation or to interfere and obstruct the investigation. The TRC would later find that this same General van der Westhuizen's efforts to cover up the South African police involvement in these massacres constituted gross human rights violations. Several others testified before the TRC that van der Westhuizen was the one who was responsible for dealing with sensitive matters when it came to security cover-up actions. While the South African police appointed this special investigation team into Matlala's claims, the ANC called upon President F.W. de Klerk to step in personally and ensure an open inquiry. Many expressed disbelief that a police investigation would carry the weight of a judicial inquiry. And indeed, those were legitimate concerns, as only days after arriving in Natal, General van der Westhuizen announced he had completed the investigation without speaking to Matlala. The police had tried to force the journalist to divulge information about his whereabouts and his allegations. The reporter ultimately turned over a recording of her interview to the police, and herself went to stay in an ANC safe house, increasingly worried about her own safety because of the involvement in these claims. The police complained about their lack of access to Matlala, who remained in hiding, but using the tape provided by the journalist, the police began to discredit Matlala, labeling him an unreliable police informer. and on April 30th announced that the investigations had revealed no evidence to substantiate his claims of a hit squad. Right, this was essentially a failed investigation. And so the inquest into his death began on the wake of this cover-up, but also as news was beginning to appear in the press about the apartheid state officially financially supporting Inkatha and training its soldiers. And in this context, it's difficult to read the press coverage of the inquest into Maphumula's death and not see the same kind of tragic comic farce of earlier state commissions into violence that essentially turned into cover-up missions. Madlala at the inquest could pick out police officers who were involved, but he mixed up their names or knew them by others. The journalist was subpoenaed to testify, but she increasingly felt that Madlala was a character sent to distract everyone from the real killer. She felt that the overall inquest itself was a farce. Now, a copy of Madlala's testimony has been archived in a private archive, but it's undated and its provenance unclear. I showed it to the reporter in question, and she didn't think it was a transcript of the conversation that she had had with him. It may, however, be the statement he gave to the ANC intelligence office or one he prepared for the inquest. As a historian, there are kind of serious questions with how I can use this document, right? And particularly considering how many attempted to discredit Madlala. But it's also because of how many people attempted to discredit Madlala that I think we need to take it seriously. The levels of state obfuscation and meddling indicated by the presence of all of those I've just named above cause one to reconsider this judgment. Was Madlala actually unreliable? Right, the use of code names by death squad members has been documented in other cases. And it goes some way to considering Madlala's ability to identify officers, but mix up their names. Madlala himself admits this in the testimony, right? He said, I worked with this guy, I called Mr. Prinsloo, but I don't think that was his real name, right? And so, it causes historians to ask, was he confused, but telling the truth about the hit squad's work? I think more likely, given the involvement of those known for obfuscation and identified earlier, I'm thinking that Madlala was purposefully unreliable, serving the aims of obscuring the role of the state. And Keith Gottschalk has looked into a number of other hit squad deaths that involved security services in KwaZulu-Natal, and he found that members of the security forces would falsely confess to protect those above them. In 1999, the public prosecutions team actually polygraphed witnesses who confessed to involvement in political murders. After this pattern emerged in which such witnesses would revoke their evidence in court, what the prosecutions team found was that those responsible would use this tactic to thwart prosecutions because they knew that false evidence would not stand up in court, and then they could not be prosecuted twice for the same crime, right? Indeed, Madlala himself alluded to such a plan had been put in place after he feared for his life after the initial confession. Beyond Madlala, a number of others who were testifying at the inquest were intimidated. Another figure related to Maphumula was murdered on the eve of the inquest. And at the end, it really was as if the state itself was on trial. They called a local Table Mountain official named Thomas Mabashe, who testified to the many people who would have reason to kill the chief. Right? And this is kind of an important flag for us when we think about these local actors, right? If we know that the security police and the state were involved in Maphumula's death, And what is this local actor doing at the inquest? We'll come back to him. But this kind of general mess of an investigation and the inquest led the judge to find that persons unknown killed the chief. Now I want to turn to some of these TRC testimonies. 5 years after Mapumulo's murder and the inquest, 2 of his widows, Tobakile Mapumulo and Nombolela Mapumulo, gave testimonies to the Human Rights Violations Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Pietermaritzburg. The Mrs. Mapumulos told of the destruction and kind of attacks on their homes with Mhlabenzima before being directed to testify on his death. In a conversation with Mjude Dlamini, who was leading the widows in their testimonies, Tobakile Mapumulo raised Sipho Madlala's confessions. She asked that the TRC find him and investigate his involvement. Now, once the widows gave their statements to the TRC, the TRC bureaucracy translated their testimonies into 3 violations: the destruction of the home, his short detention by security police, and ultimately his death. Each of the violation pre-findings reports were completed after corroboration, which involved comparing the widows' testimonies to their written statements, as well as collected press cuttings on Mapumulo. Each of these pre-findings reports presents a slightly different political context. On the burning of the Mapumulo homestead, the investigator outlined a short history of the Table Mountain region and its leader, described it as a place of stability and a haven for refugees prior to the unbending of the ANC and riven by violence after. It pointed to Mapumulo as Contralesa president committed to ending the violence. The context for his abduction and his death recognized the conflict began as a local one that spread to political organizations. All 3 reports included under them general recommendations that this case should be treated as a special investigation because one Paulo Lutuli had admitted to killing the victim. Paulo Lutuli was a distant relative of the ANC president and Nobel Peace Prize Albert Lutuli. He testified twice at the TRC, first as a perpetrator of human rights violations applying for amnesty, and secondly, at a special hearing into the trained Inkatha hit squads, the Caprivians. Lutuli had left South Africa in 1963 to join the armed struggle of the ANC. He trained in Tanzania and the Soviet Union before he was deployed in a disastrous campaign in Rhodesia, after which he was arrested in 1968. He spent 10 years on Robben Island with other famous ANC leaders. And it was there that one of them asked him to join Inkatha as a cover to recruit people into the ANC's armed struggle. And in this way, Lutuli became active in Inkatha. But the longer he was in the organization, the more he began to think like Inkatha, especially after they asked him to be the commissar of the newly organized paramilitary wing in 1986. Lutuli and 200 other Inkatha members received training from the South African Defense Force in the Caprivi Strip. These Caprivians were then deployed to Inkatha leaders and chiefs across KwaZulu-Natal, and they would later be found responsible for many of KZN's deadliest incidents of violence. At the special hearing, Lutuli gave insight into how the state's counter-revolutionary strategy worked on the ground and how it incorporated local leaders. There were kind of generally these 4 wings. One that was the field organizers and recruiters. Another was a defensive squad that did a lot of intelligence gathering. A third was the offensive squad that undertook many of the assassinations and ambushes. And then the fourth was a kind of VIP protection unit where these trained soldiers would be attached to Inkatha leaders. What Luthuli testified to was the great reliance on local leaders to identify targets. When he was asked point blank about the assassination of Mapamulo, Luthuli told the TRC that the Capribian Pumlani Mshengu came to him to report that they had taken part in the chief's murder. Now here I want to stress this. Pumlani Mshengu came to him and told him that he'd been part of the murder. Luthuli tells this to the TRC, and yet Mshengu's name never appears in any of the reports by the TRC about the chief's murder. And as far as I can tell, he has never been investigated. And despite my best efforts, I cannot find him. I can find no trace of him. What these TRC testimonies do is they prove that a state-trained hit squad murdered Chief Mapamulo. They explicitly connect Inkatha, the KwaZulu police, and the South African Defense Force to the chief's death. But these testimonies, coupled with evidence that I'll bring up next, also point to these local agents and how they not only identified targets, but stood to gain. You know, this brings us back to the headman Nduna Thomas Mabashe, who testified at the inquest, right? Did he identify the chief as a target? Prior to Mapamulo's assassination, he had been the center of significant controversies in his community around the allocation of land and the understanding of who belonged to a chiefdom. As I wrote in my first book, there were massive questions these were massive questions that revealed, even as colonialism and apartheid had undermined and transformed the chieftaincy in South Africa, people continued to understand how traditional authorities should behave from pre-colonial times. They tried to use historical understandings of chiefly authority to access security. And we see these local debates in two pieces of evidence that left a paper trail. In late 1989, at least several months prior to the outbreak of violence at Table Mountain, at Mapamulo's Table Mountain, several Mapamulo family members, headmen, and residents out for gain, including the Nduna Thomas Mabashe, spearheaded a trip to Ulundi to ask the KwaZulu Bantustan to investigate the chief. Many of these men had personal quarrels with the chief. One had attempted to position himself as a candidate for the chieftaincy. Another had actually pocketed community funds and been dismissed from his position. And Mabashe had desired to be recognized as a head Nduna, while Mapamulo favored another. These men went to the KwaZulu Bantustan and requested, they alleged that Mapamulo had misappropriated funds and pocketed payments for sites of land. These men's appearance at the Bantustan headquarters was likely relished by the chief minister of the Bantustan and the Inkatha leader, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who had his own reasons for sidelining progressive chiefs such as Mapamulo. He'd used similar investigations to sideline other progressive chiefs. But where those other investigations had succeeded, they could find that Mapamulo had done no wrong. And ultimately, the investigator shared, the problem is our informants are not reliable. They seem to be working for recognition in anticipation of Nkosi Mapamulo's discharge. Here again, we see Thomas Mabashe, this local actor, shaping how the state would deploy its counter-revolutionary strategies. When the violence did break out at Table Mountain, many community members actually saw Thomas Mabashe pointing out people to the police. a year into the violence at Table Mountain, Mapumulo was assassinated. And here, after his death, we again see the role of local conflict in fueling the state counter-revolutionary violence. After Mapumulo's death, 2 days after, the chief minister of the KwaZulu-Bantustan and the president of Inkatha released a memorandum from the residents of Mapumulo's community. The memo was attributed to members of Mapumulo's community, but it has no clear author. Though to me as historian, it sounds a lot like Thomas Mabashe, comparing the language here with what he used in the press. The memo attempts to make clear that it's the community writing and not Inkatha, though some of the members were Inkatha. Despite some ambiguities, this memo reveals how the local conflict fueled violence at Table Mountain. Right? The memorandum contended that the violence began when Mapumulo began to welcome people onto land at Table Mountain, to welcome refugees from the violence elsewhere into his community. What the memo does is it highlights this conflict over a strip of land and the refugees living on it, rather than this political battle between Inkatha and the ANC, right? The memo's author makes a clear distinction between, tribal residents and Mapumulo's comrades. What we see with this memo, more than Mabashe's personal ambition fueling local participation in state revolutionary activities, we see these very local debates about traditional authority and access to land and access. Right here, we need to recognize that membership in a chiefly community are a process that are constantly under negotiation between and within chiefdoms. As violence broke out at Table Mountain, local leaders employed claims to the people, right? Thomas Mabashe would exclude certain members of the people, while Mapumulo would include them. Right? They set up these understandings of belonging and community that reveal the kind of long impact of apartheid and colonialism on chiefly communities. We see these very local debates about what it means to be a chief and what it means to belong. And so to wrap up kind of my portion of our session today, this inquest into Mapumulo's death, the likely cover-up, the revelations at the TRC, and these pieces of community evidence, they all show that local actors played an important role in shaping how the apartheid state's security forces and counter-revolutionary strategy actually worked on the ground. This is important not only for understanding how state violence works, but also for understanding the general violence that plagued the end of apartheid. The great number of men and women who picked up arms for Inkatha often had more at stake than just their political allegiance. And to bring this full circle, this has implications for how we consider the aims of transitional justice, of bodies like the TRC, and the failure to prosecute cases after the commission. In many ways, I think looking back at Mapumulo's death brings more questions than answers, right? How can restorative justice include these people in the gray areas between clear perpetrators and between clear victims? Those who betrayed friends, comrades, and community members, those whose job or apartheid-sponsored positions facilitated counter-revolutionary violence, right? These were experiences that were not given space within the TRC's real and understandable constraints. And more concretely, I think, particularly in the wake of this week's violence in South Africa, we need to ask who stands to gain from the failure to prosecute and facilitate more community-oriented local level reconciliation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joe, for that wonderful presentation. We're very grateful for your spotlight on the conflict between victims. No, let me not use the word conflict, but the blurry lines between being victims and being perpetrators. And like these shades of gray, if I could put it that way, you know, across the interpretation of who actually a victim is and who actually a perpetrator could be. And this, you know, touches on the fact that you mentioned the cover-up by the state in terms of who is supposed to open investigation, what are, you know, the kind of credibility in terms of evidence that are given, you know, also the gender dynamics of the widows who gave their testimony in comparison to what has already been documented. These are, you know, nuances that come to the fore when we talk about transitional justice approaches, especially when it comes to truth-telling and the reconciliation processes. Just to touch on some points that you also highlighted, the failure for prosecution, you know, brings out the importance of the debate on which is more important, justice or prosecution, if you could call it criminal prosecution, or restoration within communities, you know. And it also touches on something that Andrew Vaz mentioned in his work on racial justice as transitional justice, where he talked about the incomplete transitioning processes when it comes to racial relations in the US, which we can, you know, relate to in other authoritarian contexts. You're talking about South Africa. Look at what is happening in South Africa now. And people are just saying that the incarceration of the former president is just a small screen for the actual issues of the race relations. I love the fact that you also, at the beginning of your lecture, spoke about the intra-racial conflicts, the isiZulus, the isiXhosas, which some of us outsiders may not be aware of. But so we just think it's always about color issues. We don't even know that even within the issues of color, there are also the conflicts of land, of ethnicity, of belongingness, of ownership, of exile, you know, of accommodation. You know, these are core issues when it comes to understanding conflicts, you know, and their management. One other thing that you mentioned that I also think is important to point out is the fact that we're always concerned about these broad and ground issues. It's the same thing when you look at the Human Rights Investigation Commission of Nigeria, for instance, where you talk about gross violations. So acts that don't qualify as gross violations are never being considered by this Human Rights Commission. Also to know that the time frame for the operation of these commissions are never really enough, you know. In our own case, we're still awaiting the release of the report that had been concluded in 2001, and we are hoping that perhaps when we now have the report released officially, they will now start talking about possible criminal prosecution. Because what happened was actually the president coming out to say, on behalf of the Igbos, on behalf of the Hausas, on behalf of the Yorubas, on behalf of those in the Niger Delta, I ask you all for forgiveness. So just forgive and let's move on. And here we are, 20 years after, talking about restructuring. The Yorubas want to go their way. The Igbos are always agitating, you know, to leave. And so where does this leave the intervention of the truth commissions within transitioning processes? I also think that it's important to talk about the role of technology when you talked about polygraphing of witnesses. So in terms of this, how reliable, you know, are some of the statements of these witnesses? You were talking of Ndala and how he was prone to like use the weaknesses within the criminal system to also evade prosecution, as well as some other witnesses. So you say, I did this and I didn't do it. And it's the same in Nigeria, for instance. So there is a media personality that was recently murdered, and they've turned it to like a showbiz where the girl who came out to say that she was the murderer had just come out, you know, well dressed with all made up, you know, nice makeup, nice hair, and she was supposed to come out from prison to give, you know, a counter testimony that she wasn't the person that killed the media personality. And so you're raising important questions about the criminal justice system and how reliable are they, because we are prone you know, to think that some of these systems are like impeccable. And so from my own experience, I worked on a case in in the middle belt of Nigeria. And one of the things that happened was the fact that the Human Rights Commission discovered that the people who were convicted by the Supreme Court were innocent of the charges of murder, but they could not revoke the conviction. And so those guys remained ex-convicts, even though their innocence was proven, you know, in front of the commission. So how do we actually, what kind of powers are these commissions supposed to have within transitioning processes, knowing that a lot of injustices, even within the formal criminal justice system, when you talk about the conspiracy of the state, you know, conspiracy of the state are taking place, you know, under this previous administration. Of course, in terms of scholarship, since we have some scholars within the house, you're talking of how to interpret data from a historical perspective. For instance, how reliable are these data that are available? You know, a lot of contradictions in terms of witnessing, a lot of, you know, incomplete facts that are rendered out by the state, which are supposed to be like the official facts. So how do we as social historians make a sense of this data? This, I think, is also very important. I think I should also mention the fact that when we look at national conflicts or conflicts that are on a grander scale, they always have their, you know, local implications and local actors that are driving forces for this. And they are always within a very grand plan of divide and rule. This is what I see, you know, when you look at one and the same people. I came across the name of the leader of the Nkanta Party, Buthelezi, when I was taking a course with the United States Institute for Peace, you know. And you look at the kind of place history has for such a man, you know, in terms of negotiating freedom, in terms of survival, in terms of the way he's perceived by his fellow Blacks, you know, issues like that. And in terms of how he himself wanted to aspire to power and those kind of things. So reading about even the Lituli that you mentioned, having a dad who won a Nobel Prize, here is like the child, you know, coming out as a perpetrator, and you look at the layers of family. This, you know, the issue of family even comes across to say, okay, what is the orientation of these people when it comes to the fight for freedom and the post-apartheid regime? I think I will end with the fact that we need to revisit the context of post-Mandela South Africa, which I think is important, because I think Mandela is definitive of an era within the South African socio-political landscape. The increase, you know, in terms of rage, if I could call it, they call it black rage. I do not like that term, but you know, you look at the protest space, the space of protest in terms of fees must fall, roads must fall, you know, that started immediately after it passed, and now we're looking at free Zuma, you know. And so what does that mean in terms of stability for the polity, you know, within the South African context? So we thank you very much, Dr. Kelly, for your very insightful lecture. I think we'll just go to the question and answer sessions so that we can take some of the questions. So I think I have the very first one here. Oh, no, I don't think I have. So I know you can read the questions as well, but let me just try to help you with some of those. So I think the first one is from Professor Lawani, who is talking about what is your assessment from a historical perspective of the actions and inactions of President Mandela's government in seeking redress for the victims of this state-sponsored brutality by the apartheid regime? Would you say that his tendency for reconciliation and triumphant generosity as broad-based, sorry, I'm trying to scroll, acceptance among the Black majority in South Africa?
Yeah, well, I think, thank you for the question, Professor Lawani, and it gets at, I think, some of the things that Maphumule's case reveals, right? And, you know, I think on a broad basis, people would have acceptance for ideas of reconciliation and generosity if there was actual change on the ground, right? And an example I give of this is at one point I had done an interview with a member of Mapumulu's kind of advisory board, and he was showing me the boundaries of the community that had been under dispute. And as we drove past one house, you know, he could point out and say, they stole my cattle, you know, during the end of apartheid, right? And so however much he might embrace the idea of reconciliation, he has had to recover from the very real loss of property, right? And I'm so sorry that Mlisi is not here today, because Mlisi's new book that I know you guys will be launching in the new year, he also talks about these kind of cultural efforts at reconciliation, in which some people say, well, yeah, that's a great idea, but that guy has a really nice house and I'm still living in a shack, right? That guy worked with apartheid, I fought for freedom and I'm living in a shack, right? And so there is this gap between the kind of structural changes that might make it possible for people to embrace the ideas of reconciliation. You know, most people, if you ask, you know, what do you think about the TRC? You know, they think it's a good idea, right? They appreciate what they learned. They appreciate the idea that white people can no longer say they didn't know. But to actually facilitate feelings of reconciliation, that structural part needs to be addressed. And that structural part we're seeing very much in the violence, you know, this week in South Africa.
Okay, so the next question is from Dr. Golden Timsa. She says, how do recent events play into ideas around reconciliation? I think she's referring to the current crisis in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it gets at the state's inability, right? So as I, Philip, one of the things you brought up was, you know, kind of what kind of powers can these commissions have, and what kind of powers does the state have, right? In many ways, the arrest of Jacob Zuma is this really promising action that shows how the state works. But at the same time, the violence on the ground and the state's inability to contain it shows the kind of failure of police, the failures of thus far the defense force, right? And it shows the kind of failures of the, again, the structural reconciliation, right? That especially, you know, recently the government, you know, had canceled the grant for the pandemic, right? Which means that it is very difficult for people to provide for their families. Now that government decision to cancel the grant, and I say Sponelo's hand is raised, I'm so glad. That government decision to cancel the grant is very much influenced by the fact that the state has been gutted by corruption, and you know, and that also contributes to these structural inequalities. And so, you know, I also when thinking about reconciliation and the current violence, you know, if you look at the comments right now on social media or on newspapers, and the way that white South Africans are responding to the violence shows us that reconciliation is not real, right? You know, the kind of things that come out of these commentators' mouths are like, they would be startling if we weren't aware of the kind of failures of reconciliation and the failures of structural change. So hopefully, Dr. Golden Timsar, that gets at that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we should give Sibonelo the floor to speak. I see your hand raised. If you can hear us, please, can you speak up?
Yes, hi guys, apologies, I did not mean to raise my hand, just that I'm using my cell phone, so it's difficult to type and then listen at the same time. So I thought, let me just raise my hand instead. So what I wanted to do, I think, thank you very much for the presentation first. I think it's very interesting. But I just want to ask a very, 2 or 3 questions. I'll try to make them short. One is around the concept of reconciliation itself in as far as South Africa is concerned. For instance, the way I look at it, and I have to say that I'm one of the people who believe in constitutional abolition. And so if you look, for instance, in the case of South Africa, and I think it's quite true with other African countries. Like in South Africa, there are 2 South Africas that were created, or rather one South Africa that was created before the South Africa that was created through reconciliation in 1994. The first South Africa is created in 1910 with the conciliation of the 2 white races, if I may call it that, between the British and the Boers. And that was at the exclusion of the African majority. And now what is happening now, and then what happened in 1994 was basically a reconciliation of an already conciled South Africa. So, and this is what is happening now, I think, is a result of that. And also, so I would like you to comment on that. For instance, not on the physical side of the violations that happened, that were covered up ultimately, but by the new second South Africa, which is created in 1994 through the TRC. One of the things that what you notice, for instance, with the IFP warlords, if I may call them that, is that there are so many other spiritual things that were involved, cultural spiritual things that were involved. For instance, there was never spiritual cleansing. Other people talk about those things, that when people were going to war, there was always a ceremony that was performed. In Zulu, we call it ikunga. There's intelezi, you know, that medicine that will be, the spears will be dipped in those medicines, or the guns will be dipped in that medicine. And these things were never in fact addressed. In fact, what the TRC does is that it does not look at the apartheid as a constituency when it deals with the criminalities of apartheid, but rather it wants to look at individuals and prosecute individuals rather than looking at apartheid as a constituency. And therefore that left so many red lines. And this is the problem that we are dealing with now. So the third one is to ask around the question of how much of Mapumulo's politics represented a transgression from the politics of the IFP, which the IFP was advocating for. Because if you look at it, how, for instance, in Natal, how Natal in South Africa was governed was different to how the Cape was governed. There was a racial hierarchy, whereas in Natal there was something I would call indirect rule, in the sense that you had a chief, and I think Shepstein says these things, that when in the Cape there problems of the Capetonians, you know, in fact rebelling against the apartheid state. He said, look, he makes an example about Natal. He says, look at Natal. There's no problem in Natal. You must give these people an idea that they are governing themselves. That's why you must give power to the chiefs, and the chiefs are going to govern with an iron fist. And therefore there will be this idea that we are governing in ourselves and so on. And as a result, you've seen even how the protests around Jacob Zuma began. There were people who were mobilizing, saying, Uzulu agathintwa, basically saying Zulu people are untouchable, because there is that idea that Zulu people have this capacity of governing themselves, whereas it is an apartheid tactic that was used just to keep them in that captive So those are three questions. In summary, how Mapumulo, the politics that was practiced by Mapumulo was seen as a threat to the IFP's advancement politics, for instance, of advancing for a federal state, independence of the Zulu kingdom, and how the spirituality around the killings, I heard you quote, you referred to Dr. Kamuga, and the cultural reconciliation, because if you speak about cultural reconciliation, I think you've got to involve these things of spiritual reconciliation or conciliation for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Spanelo. Those are three great questions that I would love to talk about. So let me start with the concept of reconciliation and the Constitution, right? I think part of that, the Constitution, has this wonderful Bill of Rights that recognize people's right to their culture. It also recognizes, and by doing that also then recognizes the right to traditional authority, right? And as many kind of grassroots activists have pointed out, what that has done is created this two system, right? Where people who live in the former Bantustans are still subjects, while those who live outside it are citizens, right? That kind of, which ties to indirect rule in South Africa, right? And so part of the problem with the Constitution then is it promises all of the citizens all these rights that the state, it promises that the state will continually work to providing those rights, which the state has not lived up to, right? And especially in the former Bantustans, but also because of the failure to kind of provide houses in a timely fashion, right? Creates the settlements where some of this violence is most rife, right? And so that kind of idea about the kind of 1910 reconciliation and the 1994 reconciliation is really great, Bonello, because we see that even where reconciliation is happening, things aren't changing on the ground. And so that's the kind of one way to think about reconciliation in terms of the Constitution. But the point you make about the kind of spiritual is exactly, I think, where the kind of critique of the TRC comes in, right? Is that the TRC hoped that by truth telling and some form of this kind of transitional and restorative justice, that people would feel sustainable, feel in a place that they could reconcile. But it didn't outside of those kind of best known incidents that we see in the documentaries and we see on TV, right? It didn't really require perpetrators to meet with victims and to facilitate those relationships. And, even by ignoring the structural violence, the everyday violence of apartheid, right? It doesn't set up the stage to feel fully reconciled. And like to your points about the kind of spiritual and cultural practices that might help, the former Zulu king and Jacob Zuma, and as well as a number of high-level KZN politicians have been thinking about these questions, right? And this is why I'm so sorry that Marlisi is not here, because he writes about this in his book, right? The attempts to hold an Islambo ceremony, a cleansing ceremony, to reconcile people in Kwashang and Vulindlela. And that's where the great quote I used earlier, where the guy says, reconciliation, like I heard Jacob Zuma was coming to this ceremony, but I'm still living in a shack. Who's reconciled, right? And so even where spiritual kind of efforts might help some people, it does also really mean that some people are still hurt by the kind of structural, the legacies of violence and what it did to their families and communities. Now, if I was going to bring those two together, the kind of constitutional reconciliation and the spiritual reconciliation, the point you make, Spinello, about Mapumolo's form of traditional authority being a threat to Nkata is really what I try to write about in my first book, right? That Mapumolo has this sense of what it means to be a chief that in many ways is a holdover from like African independence prior to colonial rule, right? This idea that a chief is a chief by the people, right? The proverb in Nkosi Nkosi Gabantu, right? He believes that if people recognize his authority, he has responsibilities to them in return. And that's very different from what Buthelezi and Nkata and KwaZulu and the colonial and later apartheid officials all embraced, which was this idea of this kind of dictator chiefly authority, where chiefs were responsible for making decisions, right? And Mapumolo in some ways was not only a threat to Nkata, right? I think in the late 1980s when he was meeting with the ANC in exile, he was saying, you know, chiefs should be umbrellas for their people. They should be chiefs by the people. And at that historic moment, it really resonated with the ANC, right? O.R. Tambo was giving speeches about meeting with Luthuli, about meeting with Mapumolo and sharing these ideas of leadership by the people, leadership for the people. But what's interesting is after Mapumolo was assassinated, Patakile Holomisa and Nkosi Patakile Holomisa came to take over Contralisa. And we pretty quickly saw this shift from leadership by the people and leadership for the people with this idea that, well, chiefs know best, they should make the decisions, right? And that kind of accountability gets divorced. And so in many ways, you know, Mapumolo was then known as this maverick chief. And if he had lived, you know, the question is would he have remained such? Because in many ways today, his ideas are outside of what the ANC currently thinks about traditional authority.
Thank you very much for those incisive responses. I have like a private question someone sent here. And the question is basically on what do you think could be the role of regional criminal justice systems or international criminal justice systems, you know, in trying to like manage these state cover-ups? Because initially this, the management of this kind of challenges was why the transitional justice process was initiated in the first instance, where the Yugoslavia tribunal was set up to try people outside of their own states, you know, who could, you know, manipulate it. So what do you think could be the role? How effective is the role of regional and international bodies in monitoring the justice systems, you know, within nations? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I'm going to find difficult to answer, right? One of the things that has been striking about the current situation in South Africa just this week is how little the Western press has paid attention to it. It was really only, I think, yesterday when a prominent South African journalist and kind of radio personality published a piece in the Washington Post. And before that, you know, there just wasn't any coverage. And in fact, I think as of this morning, there still wasn't something in the New York Times, right? And for some reason, you know, as you guys know from Nigeria, right? For many represents this kind of exceptional state on the continent. And also, you know, it represents the Rainbow Nation, right? You know, and this commentators always say, you know, the miracle of 1994 that, you know, you had a new state emerge with no violence, right? But what they really mean there is no violence against white people, because indeed, as we have talked about today, there was an incredible amount of violence. And so, you know, I think that this is going to be interesting to watch in the next couple of weeks and months to see how the West responds to this. And also, I mean, questions of the African Union as well, right? for several days into the violence, there was no response from the Southern African Development Union or the African Union initially. And it really took a while for everyone to respond. And so, when we think about what role international bodies might play, I think one of the things that people are going to struggle with is this idea that South Africa is some exceptional space when it's not, right? For all the reasons we talked about today in terms of indirect rule and similarities across the continent with the creation of ethnicity under colonialism and its manipulation. There are some ways in which South Africa is exceptional, but these kind of bigger ones are not. So that'll be one thing I think that shapes how international bodies respond. But the other thing that will shape is what we've seen with Kenya and elsewhere on the continent, right? Where a lot of people really do look to these international bodies for support, for justice, but those who might be held accountable by those bodies are quick to condemn them as this kind of tool of Western society or these tools of Western democracies. And so, I think that'll also be true with South Africa, which has a very kind of vocal opposition to the ANC that is quick to point out the kind of impacts of colonialism and empire that are still, their legacies are still shaping, and arguably maybe not even their legacies, but the colonialism still shapes contemporary South Africa. That's what we see with Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall. And so, I think it'll be a very contentious proposition to have international bodies get involved.
Yeah, there's one last question that I also have here. The individual wants to know about what are your thoughts on reconciliation and xenophobia in South Africa, because like the provinces or KwaZulu-Natal or the Table Mountain that I mentioned are like hot spots, for xenophobic relations. How do you think that within the context of reconciliation, this can be properly managed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also probably one that is difficult to tackle, right? So even if there was a political will to say, let's have some kind of reconciliation commission to consider recent xenophobic attacks, which are not absent in this week's violence either, is questions of legal immigration, right? If I were to compare it to America, how do you bring an undocumented immigrant before a commission to talk about their experiences of violence, right? You would not only need to have this commission to share these experiences, but you would also have a pathway to citizenship that it wouldn't mean immediate deportation, right? Perhaps more helpful than kind of having current migrants talk about their experience would be to talk to get those who had been in exile to talk about over and over again, right? How the rest of the African continent hosted and cared for migrants and exiles from South Africa who were working to end apartheid or seeking to escape the violence. And so, I think if South Africa had a pathway to citizenship for current migrants, and you had migrants who were legally documented that wanted to speak, it could provide a forum for that. But absent that kind of pathway to citizenship and documentation, it would be dangerous, right? Because you would essentially, and also, I also think about during the Civil War in South Africa, there were several attempts to hold commissions to understand what was going on, right? But what that essentially means is having victims come forward and put themselves in danger by coming forward, right? And so, there would really have to be some kind of changes kind of legally to make it possible and to facilitate that. I think some of the best efforts I have seen is in Durban, Durban University of Technology Urban Futures Center has been working with a number of migrants in Durban and to put on plays that share the stories of migrants And it's really, I think, helped some South Africans think about things differently, right? To hear those stories and understand what makes people come to South Africa. Now, I'm not saying that works for everyone, but you know, I think those are probably some of the actions we need to get people to think more humanely about their new neighbors until there's some kind of, you know, legal plan to take care of migrants.
Yeah, I think we just have barely 4 minutes left. So, well, let me also say, based on your last response, to also contribute that I think within some climes it's possible to, you know, initiate some, I think that's just criminal justice anyway, some process. So for instance, I think the US has like a provision where if somebody has a link to crime that was committed elsewhere, you could initiate, you know, a case against the person. So perhaps it may be to thinking towards the paradigm of international law and justice, you know, to come out with provisions that could not necessarily be adversarial, perhaps something that tilts towards reconciliation in terms of mindment. Maybe we don't know what the digital space would hold in terms of international criminal justice system in the future. We know we have video evidence now, you know, before different courts. Perhaps this will translate to, you know, collapsing some of these borders of sovereignties that even protect people and grant them some sorts of immunity. So thank you once again, Dr. Kelly. Sorry for dragging you into this in the middle of your holidays. You know, it was a pleasure to really.
Thank you everyone for your great questions. I have to write this up for a journal article later this year. So your questions will be very helpful in helping me get those to get this in shape. So I really appreciate everyone's attention.
Wow. So yeah, thank you very much. So just to make a very brief announcement that we're going to have our next event in the second week of August. We're trying to like spotlight a book that is being published, a handbook that was published by the United States Holocaust Museum in DC. And this is talking about a victim-driven process for action within transitional justice context. And I think it's going to be something that's very interesting. So we're encouraging all of us to also join us perhaps in the next 1 month for this program. We thank everybody who has participated in this event. We had more people register, but some have sent in their messages that the connection was bad, but it's okay. We're grateful for those who were able to attend, for your questions, your participation, and your support to the center always. And we'll look forward to seeing you during our subsequent programs. So let me just use this medium to wish everybody a pleasant evening. We also need to wish our colleagues in South Africa peace and safety during this time, and hope that there's a bit of restoration of sanity within the system in the next few days. So thank you everyone, and have a good evening.